There is a photograph taken in Chicago in the summer of 1893 that, if you look at it long enough, begins to feel deeply wrong. Not wrong in the way that old photographs often feel, with their stiff postures and faded light, but wrong in a more fundamental sense, the kind of wrongness that settles into the back of your mind and refuses to leave. In the photograph, you can see a city. Not a modest collection of buildings, not a fairground with tents and wooden stalls, but a full, monumental city. Colonnaded facades stretching hundreds of meters in every direction, domed structures rising above the tree line, grand staircases descending to a lagoon so precisely engineered it appears to belong to another era entirely. The architecture is not rustic, it is not provisional. It is the architecture of an empire at the absolute height of its power, executed in white marble, or what appears to be white marble, with a precision and scale that would challenge any construction project in the world today. The official record tells us this city was built in under 2 years. It tells us the workforce was made up of immigrant laborers operating with horse-drawn carts, hand tools, and rudimentary steam equipment. It tells us the entire complex, officially named the World's Columbian Exposition, though history remembers it as the White City, was conceived, designed, constructed, and demolished within a single administration. And then, when the fair closed in October of 1893, virtually all of it was torn down. A city that would have taken any modern contractor a decade to build was erased from the earth in less than a year. What remained was a field of ash. And the question that no architectural historian has ever answered to full satisfaction is simply this: how? To understand why the construction narrative strains credibility, it is necessary to understand what was actually built. The Court of Honor alone, the central ceremonial boulevard of the exposition, was flanked by buildings that averaged 6 stories in height, their facades covered in ornamental detail so dense and so consistent that modern stonemasons have estimated years of labor per facade section alone. The agriculture building measured over 500 meters in length. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts building was, at the time of its construction, the largest enclosed space on Earth. The entire complex covered more than 2.5 square kilometers of meticulously planned urban space, with functioning electrical infrastructure, sewage systems, elevated railways, and a network of navigable waterways fed by a purpose-built pumping station. The official timeline gives the principal architects, a group of men who, however talented, had never collaborated on a project of this scale, approximately 18 months from first design meeting to opening day. Builders who have examined the historical record in detail consistently note that even with modern equipment, a project of equivalent complexity would require not months, but decades of continuous work. Yet the White City opened on schedule, fully functional, structurally immaculate, and by all contemporary accounts, finished. Not approximately finished, not finished enough for a temporary exhibition. Finished in the way that great permanent cities are finished, with a completeness that suggests the labor required had already, in some meaningful sense, been done. Chicago in 1893 would be remarkable enough if it existed in isolation, but it does not. The pattern repeats with inconsistency that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. The 1889 Paris Exposition Universelle produced the Palais du Trocadero, a vast, horseshoe-shaped auditorium seating thousands, alongside dozens of palatial exhibition halls, all reportedly constructed within a similar compressed timeline. The 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo produced a city of Baroque towers and illuminated courts that contemporary visitors described as more beautiful than anything they had seen in Europe. The 1904 St. Louis World's Fair covered over 5 square kilometers and contained over 1,500 buildings, making it at the time the largest international exposition ever held. Each of these events followed the same template: an announcement, an impossibly short construction window, a moment of worldwide wonder, and then demolition. The cities appeared and vanished like a recurring dream, always just at the edge of the historical record, always just beyond the reach of full documentation. What makes this pattern worth examining is not merely the speed of construction, but the style. Across decades and continents, the architecture of these expositions shared a vocabulary so consistent it appears to derive from a single source. the same Roman colonnades, the same Beaux-Arts domes, the same relationship between water, public space, and monumental facade appear in Chicago, Paris, Buffalo, St. Louis, and San Francisco, as though drawn from a common blueprint, or recovered from a common original. Independent architects in different countries, working from different cultural traditions, consistently arrived at structures that felt less like original designs and more like faithful reconstructions of something older, something they were attempting to remember rather than invent. If the construction of these cities is difficult to explain, the demolition is almost more so. Most of the great exposition buildings were destroyed within months of closing, often by fire. The White City burned in 1894. The Baltimore fire of 1904 destroyed the remnants of structures that had stood for less than a year. The pattern of rapid, total destruction is so consistent across so many expositions that some researchers have begun to ask whether the demolitions were less about clearing the land and more about erasing the evidence. A temporary building, after all, does not need to be burned. It can simply be left to decay or dismantled for salvage. The decision to incinerate structures of such evident quality, structures that by any reasonable assessment could have served as permanent civic buildings, suggests a different motivation, though the historical record does not name one. What the record does preserve is the testimony of visitors. Across dozens of contemporary accounts, one phrase recurs with striking regularity. Visitors to these expositions consistently described the experience not as attending a fair, but as entering a city that already existed, a city that felt inhabited rather than constructed, ancient rather than new. One journalist writing from the White City in 1893 noted that the buildings did not have the smell of new construction. They had, he wrote, the smell of old stone. He attributed this to the materials used. It is worth asking whether there was another explanation. There is another anomaly that runs through the historical record of these expositions, quieter than the architectural questions, but in some ways more difficult to explain away. The workers are missing. Not missing in the sense that their names were unrecorded. Immigrant labor in the 1890s was poorly documented, and that absence is expected. Missing in a more specific sense. The volume of human labor required to produce these structures within the documented timelines simply does not appear in the historical record of the cities that hosted them. Chicago in the early 1890s was a city of approximately 1 million people. The labor pool available for a major construction project was finite, and it was already heavily committed to the rapid expansion of the city itself. Contemporary accounts of the exposition's construction mention workers, but the numbers cited are inconsistent with the scale of work completed. There are no records of the mass mobilization that a project of this magnitude would have required, no tent cities for laborers, no documented supply chains for the quantities of stone and steel that the official structures would have demanded, no civic records of the disruption that building the largest enclosed space on Earth in 18 months would inevitably have caused. The simplest explanation for the absence of these records is that they were never kept. The more uncomfortable possibility is that the labor was not performed in Chicago at all, that what was presented to the world as a feat of rapid American construction was in fact something older, something that arrived at the site of the exposition in a different condition than the official narrative suggests. Not built, but uncovered. Not constructed, but cleaned. Not created for the fair, but displayed within it. The World's Fairs of the late 19th century have always been understood as celebrations of progress, monuments to industrial ambition, showcases of national power, temples to the idea that humanity was moving forward at an unprecedented pace. And perhaps they were all of those things. But they may also have been something else. If the cities were not built but found, if the grand expositions were the mechanism by which the remnants of an older urban inheritance were presented to the public, catalogued, and then systematically destroyed, then the fairs take on a different character entirely. They become not celebrations of what was being built, but farewells to what was being cleared away. The ash fields left behind after each exposition's demolition have never been fully excavated. The foundations beneath the fairgrounds have, in several cases, revealed structural elements inconsistent with temporary construction. Stonework too deep, too precisely laid, too evidently old to have been placed in the months the official record allows. What the ground beneath these sites contains, what survives beneath the parks and parking lots and civic buildings that replaced them, remains largely uninvestigated. The century that followed the Great Fairs was not a century inclined to question their origins. We are told that the White City was a dream, a temporary vision of what American cities could become, dissolved back into nothing when the dream was over. But dreams do not leave foundations. Dreams do not smell of old stone, and dreams do not require burning. What if the most spectacular cities in human memory were not built for the future, but borrowed from the past, displayed once, briefly, under electric light, and then erased before anyone thought to ask where they came from? The ash is still there, underneath the grass, and no one has ever fully explained what burned.